Well, okay, so we're at the hour and we have a lot to talk about. So we're going to dive straight in. My name is Ben Worrell. I'm a solutions engineer here at Bitrise. For those that don't know, Bitrise is a mobile DevOps platform. We do things like continuous integration. We have a release management tool for publishing into the stores, the app stores, and build cache for things like Bazel. Traditionally, what I've seen in mobile teams is that Bazel is adopted by iOS teams whenever they hit the limitations of what Xcode build can do for them, or just sort of scaling challenges of too many people dealing with an Xcode project. Less common is Android. And so when I saw Pavlo had done this twice now, Android on Bazel, and built this migration tool called Airin, I was really interested, and I thought it would be a cool webinar just for the community to learn a little bit about Pavlo's experience. So we threw this together, and I appreciate everybody joining. So Pavlo, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm Pavlo. Yeah, I work as a senior staff engineer at Turo. So Turo is a car sharing marketplace. So yeah, I focus mostly on product work, but occasionally I take some platform and infrastructure initiatives, which includes Bazel. So yeah, I had some experience of integrating Bazel at Turo. And before that, I worked at Lyft. Everyone knows Lyft. I was part of the mobile infrastructure team there. I was not the core maintainer of Bazel, but Lyft app is both mobile apps are built as Bazel. And yeah, I contribute a few things here and there to Bazel stuff there. And before that, I worked at Grab, which is like a huge ride-sharing app and service in Singapore. And like in Southeast Asia, they have this concept of super apps. So super app is like a huge app that includes inside multiple services like ride sharing, like food delivery, and like tons more. I don't even remember all of them. And because of that, the code base is very huge. Consists of like I think now it's more than 1,000 of Gradle modules, so like overall modules, I mean. So yeah, and that was my first experience of tackling the Bazel. And like I joined the platform team, which was just starting migrating their app from Gradle to Bazel. Yeah, so this is how my journey with Bazel started. It was fun but challenging. So yeah, happy to talk about it.
Cool. Thank you for the intro. I want to, before we get too deep into things, I want to level set and make sure that everybody has background info on Bazel. So traditionally, the default build system for Android projects is Gradle, and it's doing a lot for us. Like it's compiling, but it's doing more. It's often handling maybe like signing tasks or any arbitrary tasks that you define. It's running tests, and so Bazel is a build system that can do the same things for us. Um, it is designed for monorepos, so it's language agnostic, and it can be used on any sort of project. And so we've seen often larger teams with large apps, like Pavlo was just talking about, adopting Bazel because it has certain characteristics that are helpful, and we're gonna get into that later. So the structure of this conversation is we'll talk about why to use Bazel and when is appropriate, and then we'll talk specifically about Pavlo's experiences using it in different places, and some of the challenges associated with that. And then a little bit about where is this community, this small Android on Bazel community, where can you find help? And that'll be our conversation. We're going to pack a lot into a short period of time. And so before we get too much further, Pavlo, you are also the author and creator of the Airin migration tool, which helps teams to migrate their Gradle config over into Bazel. And so can you just tell us a little bit about that tool, why you created it, and what it's done for you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so basically the goal of the tool is to help with the automation of the migration process. Because yeah, imagine you have a huge project that consists of thousands of modules and you're gonna need to migrate it to Bazel. So first we need to consider, okay, what do we even mean by migrating the project from Gradle to Bazel, right? Because kind of might be challenging just to understand. So if you remember, Gradle projects have those built Gradle files for each module of the project, and those files have the configuration written in Groovy or Kotlin that defines what this module is, how should it build sources inside and stuff like that, and how does it depend on other modules in the project. So when we're speaking about migrating the project to Bazel, we basically mean that we need to create a bunch of another types of files just for Bazel called like build.bazel. So yeah, the problem here is that imagine you're migrating a huge project of 1,000 modules, and you obviously can try to do it manually, which is fine, but the problem is that the process is not overnight. So you cannot just do it in one week or like day or like a couple of days. However, once while you're performing the migration, uh, your the rest of the team in your organization, they usually don't care about your migration. They care about building features and in projects and like evolving the app, which means they constantly adding modules, removing modules, modifying them and stuff like that. So the purpose of Airin, the tool I built, was to automate the migration so that it's a Gradle plugin that hooks into your build system and it just scans your Gradle build configuration and it replicates it with Bazel. So it just generates a bunch of Bazel files which can build the project for you. The problem here is that there is no uniform way to migrate at like to map one-to-one Gradle and Bazel features because there are a bunch of Gradle plugins and there is a keyword in a Gradle plugin called Gradle, meaning that Bazel does not know anything about them. So the tool is not just, some black box that just does things for you. It's kind of rather like a guide. So like you provide it and you help it to understand how to map different features from Gradle into Bazel, and then it helps you to automate this process and generate all the files. So
And
yeah.
in a standardized way across all of the
Yeah.
many modules. And you mentioned about Gradle plugins, and that's something I'm going to want to talk about a little bit later, especially the Android specific ones. But let's go into more of your experiences at these different engineering teams, and what was the limiting factor that these different teams were experiencing with Gradle that triggered that investigation and then that ultimate migration over to a different build system?
Mhm.
What are those pain points that teams hit?
Yeah. So, usually it's all started for me when I worked at Grab a couple of years ago. I just joined a platform team which was starting doing that. And the reason for that was usually teams start to think about their build times and build system when they face problems with build times, right? So usually it's slow build times and also slow sync times or configuration times. So when you open Android Studio, for example, and it starts to do syncing, and it was taking forever, and clean builds were taking like 45 minutes or like even more. Yeah, so there were a couple of learnings from that. Some of them, you know, after some of them, you can say that, okay, Bazel is a good thing, but other problems are build system agnostic. So it's a very important thing to balance and to understand which things can be fixed by a build system and while other things are not related to that. So yeah, but it's
Yeah,
like a very good thing to understand that at first.
I what I've come to recommend whenever I'm speaking to an engineering team that uses Bitrise and they're curious about Bazel is my first recommendation is first make sure that the architecture of your app is in a good place. It's a horizontal architecture and not tons of deeply nested modules, or very thin but tall. First do that. It's like eat your vegetables, and then we can start to look at other things. So I totally get that. Whenever you so it sounds like there were benefits particularly related to performance that you were looking for. Were there any other benefits that you were looking for?
Yeah, I would say, the common kind of misconception people have when they start thinking about Bazel is that it just some magically will reduce your raw build times, right? So in some cases it can do it, but yeah, as we just saw, as we just discussed, there's it's a little bit more intricate thing, and like you need to have a correct multi-module architecture. You need to make sure your build graph is good for incremental builds and stuff like that. Uh, so yeah, but overall, Bazel adds a bit much more flexibility to the build configuration of your project. Initially, like Bazel was built by Google and it was used internally, and it's called Blaze. I think it's even now called Blaze. And the purpose was to build a huge monolith, not monolith, but monorepo code base where basically have a single repo, kind of like a Git repo, but they use something different for version control, I guess. But the key thing was there to build a huge monorepo with like a lot of code sits in one place. And they needed a build system that is very flexible and granular, that can split the code base into small chunks and build them individually. Also, it can sync those modules individually. So there is a cool feature called partial sync where you open the project, and if you have a project that consists of thousands of modules, you can avoid indexing all of them. You can just index your module and maybe like one level deep of dependency graph, which means that at one moment in time, you're working with one single module and like you don't need to index all of the code. And by indexing, I mean like, uh, syntax highlighting and overall like understanding the code in general by the IDE. So yeah, and
That
there are
sounds
yeah
like it directly solves that problem of the
yeah
incredibly low Gradle sinks that
yeah. I
you
think yes,
started.
it's one of the biggest problem with like people start seriously think about Bazel is like not even build times, because build times can be fixed with different approaches, but sync times, yeah, you can hit a wall here. Also, like Bazel, from my experience, has a very cool query language. So like you can consider it as a sequel of as a sequel, but for Bazel. So
Mhm.
you can create different conditions and like request build system. Okay, give me a bunch of targets that correspond to this action, this condition. And the cool use cases for that is that, for example, when you open a PR, right, pull request on GitHub, for example, you can analyze the diff and identify which files were changed. And then when you're building a CI, like when you're running the CI job for building the projects, you can rebuild only those modules that were impacted and
Mhm.
like, and like have more flexibility. Or you can have parallel builds, which is awesome, right? So like
Yeah.
not a single CI job will be building a project, but a bunch of parallel jobs, which
Right.
also significantly speeds up, right? So like
That that I think from what I can see, at least within the mobile world, is not commonly achieved. That's sort
yeah,
of like expert level is the remote execution, uh,
yeah.
pretty far
You have
down the line.
you have the velocity, which is like a Gradle's product.
Yeah.
You should pay for that, but I think it provides you some ability to run tests in parallel. But with Bazel, you can be more flexible about that, which is cool.
So we've got a couple of questions in the chat. Why does architecture matter when migrating to Bazel? I think we touched on that, but essentially, the more you modularize, the more you can sort of, one change doesn't affect gigantic portions of the build graph, and also allows you to use some of these features that Pavlo just mentioned. And then there's another question about Android libraries. I want to get to that one later. Um, but one thing I wanted to ask was you mentioned the Develocity product, and there's a nice feature of that, which is the build scan. Tells you a lot of information about the execution of that Gradle task. I'm wondering, is that something that you relied on in pre-Bazel, and how did you get some of the information that you might have lost from that, once you've moved to Bazel?
Yeah, build scans is a really cool feature. So yeah, it gives you like a very detailed breakdown about how long did like very small parts of your build process took, like what were the challenges with cache hits, for example, and stuff like that. So I know the Velocity is building support for Bazel right now. I don't know the state of things there. I haven't used it for Bazel, but yeah, this is a huge point that it's build scans is a very cool feature, which is not part of Gradle suite of tech, right? So like,
Yeah.
but yeah, for
There's
Bazel, yeah,
go ahead.
no, for Bazel, I think uh, what different teams do, they try to build some manual tooling, just reporting different timestamps during the build process and do that. But yeah, hopefully build scans for Bazel will become like stable and feature rich soon. But yeah, honestly, I haven't tried that for Bazel
Yeah,
yet.
okay. And do you make use of the Bazel event protocol and pipe that into any sort of analytical tool?
Yeah, so like when you're building custom tooling for that, this might be handy. You just need to intercept different events that are happening with Bazel. I think build scans for Bazel actually use some like event protocols. This was probably, yeah, this would be a
Base
logical way to
times.
go. Yeah.
Okay.
Build scans, they already have like a nice UI and overall infrastructure for building that. So yeah, they'll add value on top of that.
So let's talk a little bit about the outcomes. Um, Maybe we can focus on Turo so far, and I think there's a question about starting with a single module and just seeing how that goes. Maybe you can tell us where is the project at Turo right now? How have you done that in a progressive way, and how have you uh, measured the outcomes to the degree that you are measuring outcomes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. I would maybe like to first start with the question from the audience regarding the single module. So I would say like for single modules, you will not identify any benefits for building them with Bazel or Gradle, because the power of Bazel is when you're building a huge amount of modules. And Bazel can be very smart about organizing this process in an efficient way. But ultimately, both Gradle and Bazel, I mean, I will very simplify here, but these are the tools that call compilers, right? They just like, I mean, yeah, they add a bunch of cool
It's
features, but
the same work that's happening
yeah.
at the end of the
So
day.
like Bazel will not make your compiler faster. So like I would suggest, yeah, I would say that comparing a single module for Gradle and Bazel will not give you the information you seek, because they will most probably be the same. So yeah, as for migration efforts to Turo, the process now is ongoing. So the first iteration was I basically wrote a bunch of stuff regarding my automation tool, Airin, that we mentioned. And yes, it's now scales more. And now the processing is ongoing because the Bazel adoption is a very tedious process. So basically, you have a bunch of technologies in your app. Let's say somebody asked about libraries. Yeah, so this is a
Android
good
libraries.
question. Yeah, so not all libraries and technologies are supported with Bazel out of the box. A good example, for example, like recently from what I was dealing it with, not at Turo, but in general, the Hilt library for dependency injection. Nice library, does pretty much a lot of cool stuff, but it relies a lot of on Gradle plugin and a bunch of magic behind that. And you can run Hilt with Bazel. However, there are some restrictions, and with Hilt specifically, you will need to actually modify your source code. You will need to add a bunch of annotations to your classes. So yeah, and my point here is that there are a lot of technologies that rely on Gradle plugins that are not available for Bazel out of the box. So the process is to identify what the list of technologies that you have, and then one by one try to solve them. So first of all, you, for example, you take some technology like, I don't know, the most issues I had at Grab was data binding because it's not fully supported with Bazel. You identify this technology and you write a bunch of rules using Starlark language, similarly to what you would use Kotlin in Gradle. But basically, you just write some code for build system to actually be able to reason about it and build it. Once you do that, then you use an automation tool to scale it to the entire your code base. So yeah, this is what's going on right now. And overall, I would say I would not recommend to relying on numbers that other companies provide, because there are so many variables that go into build times. It's build system, it's architecture, it's list of technologies, it's amount of modules, it's some details about your internal infrastructure. If you just hear that, okay, this company improved the build times by whatever amount of percentage is, I mean, that's cool. That's an inspiring story that helps you to sell this technology to your leadership and just, you know, get some buy-in on that. But your results might be completely different. And as I mentioned, you know, the benefit is not only the raw build times improvement, but rather some cool things like you have CI, better like flexibility for CI. You have a better configuration language, which is restricted. And like, it's good that it's restricted because when you write some custom rules, you in Gradle, you can accidentally like, you know, call get current timestamp, which is different every time you compile the project. Or like you can do some IO. And with Bazel, it's all restricted, so you have more stability there. Yeah, so I would refrain from giving numbers because first, the process is still ongoing for Turo, but second, yeah, I would just rely on some practical improvements. And as we mentioned, it's partial sync and stuff like that. But to be fair, in some cases, Bazel can, not in some, but in all cases, it can be beneficial because it has one more cool feature called persistent workers. So basically, in different build systems, when it tries to build different tasks and different actions, it kind of spawns a separate process for that, runs it and kills it. But persistent workers, they live through many tasks and actions. They persist, and build system does not waste resources on creating and cleaning those things, which can save you time. But yeah, I will be as specific as that in this case.
Uh, can you go back a little bit to some of the custom logic that you have to write when supporting Android libraries? Because it sounds like there are two aspects of it. There's the actual Gradle plugin, which you have to recreate in some way, and then in some cases, it sounds like you have to make changes to the actual source of the dependency. How is the community going about making this easier for new users and upstreaming these changes into the original projects, and what's sort of happening at the community level to make this? Obviously, there will be more and more dependencies where this work has to be done, but hopefully over time it will become more and more supported.
Yeah, so you know, community for Bazel overall is very small but enthusiastic. Uh, so consequently, a bunch of stuff is not available out of the box for Bazel. Moreover, Google invests heavily in Gradle support in the Android Gradle plugin, and they don't have plans, from my understanding, to stop doing so. So Gradle still will be the primary build system, which means that a lot of features from Android Gradle plugin will be unavailable. Because, there is a separate thing as Gradle, and there is an Android Gradle plugin that knows how to build Android specific. And Bazel does not know much about that. Some part of that is recreated with Bazel. It's part of the source code and stuff. But for example, Bazel will not allow you out of the box to have build config generated files, like a simple file with some stuff generated for like with metadata about your module.
Like a version number or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's not available out of the box. It's not hard to do that. You just need to generate a file, and get some information from your build configuration. But yeah, things like Android app bundles, flavors, they are not available out of the box, but you can, for example, with flavors, you can implement them in different ways in Bazel. So like Bazel allows you and provides you these features. And I think flavors are not available because, uh, Bazel has some different idiomatic ways to do that. But yeah, TLDR, a lot of stuff isn't available. And in most cases, you are reinventing the wheel actually, because you need to go okay, you see that something is not building. You need to figure out why it's not building, and then you realize, okay, something uh, from Android Gradle plugin is not available in Bazel. So what do? You go to Android Gradle plugin and try to read its sources and understand like what is going on there. And those sources are not documented because they're not supposed to be used by public in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're available, but it's up to you to interpret them. So yeah, and then when you figure that out, you need to recreate all of that using Bazel language for configuration called Starlark, which is like Python, but restricted, as we discussed. And you need to make it in idiomatic way for Bazel because Bazel has an API and protocols for interacting between tasks and like how do you send data from one task to another and stuff like that. It's all different. So it's a lot of
And
tedious
then
work.
the next version of the Android Gradle plugin comes out.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I remember at Lyft, we had a dedicated person that was constantly working on updates for new versions of Android Studio. So like it's a full-time job to make sure that all new updates are kind of correspond to your build configuration.
And so I want to go back to with just a couple minutes left, question about community. Um, where is the community? Where can people find the community? Is there, is it Slack? Is there Discord, message board, whatever? And how are the teams that are making this big investment sharing the fruits of their labor with the community so that you can get that, uh, you know, economies of scale?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so there is an official Slack channel from Bazel. I think this is like a main place where discussions happening. Also, there is
There,
an
it's an Android channel within the Bazel Slack, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there is a bunch of more interesting stuff uh apart from Android there. So like you can just, learn because amazing thing about Bazel, it's available for many platforms and many concepts can be shared. Also another thing is BazelCon. There is a cool conference hosted by Google where like they gather every year a lot of information about Bazel. And also all the efforts to support Bazel on different platforms and technologies, it's all open source. So you will have, if you want to find something, if your language of choice is supported by Bazel, you just Google your technology, then Bazel rules. And you will have a GitHub
Mhm.
repo prefixed with the rules. You open it and you go to issues, discussions, and you can find a lot of information there. Yeah, so Stack Overflow is not your friend in this case because very it's not rich with the base information there because it's a very like niche thing.
Well, we are at time. I want to thank Pavlo. Thank you for sharing your experience and your expertise in this. I learned quite a bit and it was a fun conversation. And I think it was helpful for our audience as well. And I also want to thank our audience for joining. And you will think you will get an email recording of this talk. And I'm going to put my email, ben.borel@bitrise.io. I've just put that in the webinar chat. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can send me an email. And yeah, everybody have a wonderful day, wonderful evening, wherever you are. And I hope you learned something, and we'll see you at the next webinar.
Thank you, everyone.